Hey everyone. Hey everyone. Welcome to Guarded Acumen. I hope everyone's coming in. I just sent the announcement right now. So hopefully some of you are trickling in. Looks like some people have joined. Cool. So yeah, looks like we're all set up. So yeah, thanks for joining everyone. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone on the Discord for lining up, pre-saving the video. But yeah, without further ado, I want to just say in today's stream, we're going to be joined by Joe from Majesty of Reason to discuss his latest contribution to Prosblogion entitled "An Endless Future is an Actual Infinite." In the post, he's going to be offering 5 arguments for the conclusion that an endless future is an actual infinite. So, for those interested in reading the post, go down below into the description and you can find a link there to read it on your own. But yeah, thanks for coming on, Joe. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here, and I'm excited for what's coming forward on your channel.
Cool. So, as a primer for today's discussion, I think it will help that we first explain what makes your 5 arguments even relevant for those interested in philosophy of religion and those interested in discussions pertaining to the Kalam. So, if you could you probably lay out the reasons for the post, and then after we've done that, we can move in to just dissecting the post, going through the 5 arguments one by one.
Yeah, good. So, what's significant about this post? Why does it matter? Why should it interest people? So, this is broadly in philosophy of religion, and we're looking, as you said, at the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, the Kalam cosmological argument is an argument for the existence of God, and it goes as follows. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist as a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. So, conclusion, the universe has a cause. And then in a second stage of reasoning, it is argued that this cause has various godlike features. So that second premise says that the universe began to exist. There are various different ways that defenders of the Kalam try to justify this premise. Some are scientific in nature, some are philosophical in nature. So we're focusing here on the philosophical justifications for that second premise. And usually the philosophical justifications for the second premise are taking aim at the infinite past. They're saying, hey, in some manner or another, an infinite past is absurd or impossible or otherwise contradictory. And if that's the case, well, then the past must be finite. And then they try to argue that that implies that the universe began to exist, thereby substantiating the second premise of the Kalam. So we're looking at philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past, at least in its manifestation in the work of William Lane Craig and several others. But Craig offers 2 main philosophical arguments for that second premise and for the finitude of the past. One such philosophical argument is the successive addition argument. And it basically says you can't form an actually infinite collection, and don't worry, we'll define what an actually infinite collection is in a second. But it says you can't form an actually infinite collection by successive addition, by adding one element at a time successively. But the past is a collection formed by successive addition, and hence the collection of past events cannot be actually infinite. So the argument goes, I've got a lot of videos on my channel that critically assess basically everything that has to do with the Kalam, so check out my Kalam playlist for those interested. But the second philosophical argument is really what interests us here. And it's the argument from the impossibility of actual infinites. And the basic idea is that actual infinites are impossible. It is impossible to have a collection which actually has infinitely many members because it has various absurd properties or very counterintuitive properties. And if that's the case, well, then the past can't be beginningless. It can't be infinite, because if it were infinite, then the collection of past events would constitute an actual infinite. It would be a collection with infinitely many members, and that is allegedly absurd. And so it's impossible. All right, so how is my post relevant to that? Well, if you take that line of reasoning seriously, if you really think an actual infinite is impossible, if you think any collection with infinitely many members is impossible, you're in a very sticky situation, because it seems as though the future could be endless. Firstly, that seems kind of obvious. Secondly, it's taught in various religious traditions like Christianity and Islam that there's an endless afterlife awaiting us, perhaps of a good sort, perhaps of a bad sort, perhaps of a neutral sort. Whatever sort it is, there's an endless afterlife awaiting us, according to these various religious views. So, plausibly, the future could be endless. Importantly, though, if the future is endless, the future is an actual infinite, and that's what I argue in the post. And so if you're going to say that an actual infinite is, well, we basically have a set of 3 inconsistent claims. Firstly, the future is endless. Secondly, if the future is endless, then, I'm going to back up. We have 3 inconsistent claims. One of them is the future could be endless. So it's a possibility claim. The future could be endless. The second claim is that if the future could be endless, then there could be an actually infinite collection, namely of future days or future seconds or whatever. And thirdly, actual infinites are impossible. Those three are jointly inconsistent. So, because this argument requires affirming the second two of those, it requires denying that the future could be endless. And that seems really implausible. It seems as though the future could be endless, and again, religious views commit to the possibility of an endless future. Okay, so that's the basic problem. The basic problem is that this argument can't succeed because if it did, it entailed that the future is necessarily finite, it necessarily comes to an end, but that's false, and hence this argument fails. Okay, that's the basic thrust. It's a bit of a tricky dialectical situation, but I hope that situates the audience well.
Yeah, I like that. How I understand it, at least, and you can correct me if I ever go wrong here, is that you have proponents of the Kalam, following Craig at least, who have this general argumentative strategy against the possibility of any actual infinite collection or actual set. And what they'll argue is that a beginningless series constitutes an actual infinite, but because the future is not numerable, that is, it's not the sort of thing that you can count all the numbers of, or events, future events, if you will, that it is not impossible, the endless series of future events. So they demarcate this symmetry, or rather asymmetry, between the beginningless series of events and an endless future series of events. And so what you're saying, though, is that the future is in fact numerable, and so symmetrical with a beginningless series of events. And if that's the case, if their argument against a beginningless series of events works, then it will likewise work based off of this parallel consideration with a future series of events. That's kind of roughly the idea, right?
Yeah, that's basically the thrust of the reasoning. Now,
Mhm.
Craig thinks future events are numerable because he
Mm.
thinks that there are determinate facts about. So he's not like an open theist or anything like that. So he thinks that, yeah, we can still count how many future things there will be. He just says whenever we refer to those things, we don't have to take that reference as ontologically committing, etc. He goes the way of the potential infinite and says that an endless future is a potential infinite. We'll get into that later. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Okay.
overall, what you said was correct.
Okay, great. So I think now we can just go ahead and show the post right over here, and we can go ahead and just start dissecting some of the arguments. Again, you offer 5 of them. So let me just get us here on board. So I'm not sure if you can see that there, Joe. You got that?
I can see
Great.
it. You might want to zoom in a
Awesome.
little bit, but
Yeah, zoom in a little bit. Cool. Let's go ahead and do that if we can. Great. So yeah, this is the post, in endless futures and actual infinite. Once again, for those interested in reading it, you can go ahead and go to Prosblogion. It should be right there on the cover page. But yeah, like you promised, we're going to just be going through some definitions first, and then just going off into each one of the arguments. So if you could, Joe, perhaps we could just start breaking this
yeah.
down.
Yeah. So, yeah, like we said, the main thrust, the main thesis of this post is that an endless future is an actual infinite. So, we need to get some terms on the table, and this is how these terms are used in the Kalam literature at large. So, an actual infinite is a collection with infinitely many members. Okay, now for present purposes, the relevant infinity is the first transfinite cardinal. It's Aleph Null or Aleph Null. I like Aleph better, but you can pronounce it either, and I prefer Aleph. Okay. So yeah, we're talking about collections. These collections have members, and we can number the members. If the number of the members is Aleph Null, that is, if it's infinite, if it's the smallest infinite, then it is an actually infinite collection. And really, what defines Aleph Null as a transfinite cardinal is equinumerosity with the collection or the set of natural numbers. And what that means is that you can put any actually infinite collection, again, which has a cardinality of Aleph Null, into a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. So the crucial demarcation here between an actual infinite and other collections is being able to be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, right? So you can pair one member of this collection with number one member of this collection with the number 2, one member of this collection with the number 3, one member of this collection with the number 4, and so on. And there's a unique member for every natural number. Now, notice that the members of a collection do not all need to exist, whether simultaneously or not. They do not all need to exist in order to be an actual infinite, in order to be an actually infinite collection. All they need to be is numerable or able to be numbered, right? And to see this, right, just notice that William Lane Craig, for instance, he adopts presentism, right? He thinks that only present things and events exist. The past doesn't exist. The future doesn't exist. And yet, Craig still thinks that a beginningless past is an actual infinite, right? So the members of that collection, the members of this collection of past events or past days or past seconds or whatever, they do not exist at all. They're nothing. Under presentism, they do not exist. And yet, Craig still thinks this is an actual infinite. Why is that? Well, because this collection still has numerable members. You can still number them, and you can put them in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. That is what is crucial for being an actually infinite collection. Whether or not the members exist, there just need to be members of the collection. There needs to be like a determinate fact of the matter about what are the members of the collection. And secondly, there needs to be a determinate number to them, and that number needs to be such that the members of the collection can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. It needs to be Aleph null. That needs to be the cardinality, or the number of members of the collection. Okay.
Could I actually
So,
ask
yeah,
something real quick? So,
yeah.
what would you say then? I forget. Believe this was for the Heat Conference 2021, so last year. There was a paper submitted by someone from Biola who argued that the growing block theory could help save us from this conundrum, right? For them, so long as we actually have these past concrete states of affairs and events and objects existing, and so long as those are existent, this is somehow going to break it's going to break the symmetry between the past and the future, because on their view, future events don't exist. So they're making recourse to the ontological status of the past and the future items and events and states of affairs. So you would say to this whole project, this whole endeavor of appealing to some ontological theory of time, like growing block, that's not going to save them. Like that's completely irrelevant to what it is that makes the beginningless series or the infinite endless series infinite. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that is correct. I mean, one problem with that response is that growing block theory is false. So that's the first problem. But the second problem is that, all that matters for being an actual infinite is that the members need to be numerable. Now, the growing block people might say, okay, hold on a second. Let's define an existent actual infinite as distinct from, let's say, a non-existent actual infinite, where an existent actual infinite is an actually infinite collection. So there are members, or the members of the collection can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, and they all exist. Okay, whereas a non-existent actual infinite is an actually infinite collection, but the members do not all exist. Then they might try to say, okay, I'll grant you, Joe, that your argument works as a response to the philosophical argument for the finitude of the past in terms of actual infinites, but I can recast the argument in terms of existent actual infinites. What I'm going to say, so the growing block theorist hypothetically would say here, is that existent actual infinites are metaphysically impossible. The past series of events, if it is beginningless, is an existent actual infinite collection. And so the past series of events must have a beginning. So that's something that they could say. The problem, though, as I would respond to that, is that let's look at the justification for why they think that an existent actual infinite is impossible. If it's the same justification that Craig gives, namely, actually infinite collections, regardless of whether they're existent or not, have various absurd or counterintuitive properties, well, then the justification for their premise there in terms of existent actual infinite collections equally carries over to a premise in terms of actually infinite collections simpliciter. Because regardless of whether or not the members of the actually infinite collection exist, even if they don't exist, so long as they're numerable, we're going to get all the alleged absurdities of existent actually infinite collections. Why is that? Well, because the members of the non-existent actually infinite collection, so long as they're numerable, can still be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. And so they have all these various absurd properties, like proper parts being equinumerous with the whole collection. And they also have, you have Galileo's paradox, which I talk about in my Hilbert's Hotel video. You have weird properties of subtraction, right? You can take away members from the collection, as it were, as days go by, and yet the number of members in that collection is still the same, right? So despite the fact that you subtracted members, it still stays the same, etc. So you get all these allegedly absurd features, and they attend an endless future. They attend any actually infinite collection, regardless of whether or not it's an existent actually infinite collection. So that argument, that proposed revision for the growing block theorist, is not going to work, because the justification for their premise, again, if it's relying on the justifications that Craig provides, namely the absurd properties of actually infinite collections, the justification for the premise is equally going to be applying regardless of whether or not it's an existent actually infinite collection or a non-existent actually infinite collection. So ultimately, it's just totally irrelevant whether or not future events exist. All that matters is whether or not they are numerable, whether or not we can count them. And I think that that's obvious. Like even under presentism, we can still say how many days will have gone by within the next future week. Okay, the answer is obviously 7, right? If you say like 0, you're just wrong. Okay, like that's the basic thrust. Now, open future views might be able to deny that, but we'll talk about open future views later on because I think those might afford a way to get out of these arguments. But uh, theists typically do not want to take an open future view because then it'll commit them to open theism, and open theism has various problems.
Okay, great. I appreciate the clarification. So we already have the actual infinite now all set up, and now we have to go on to the next term in question, which will be a potential infinite. So could you break that down for us?
Yeah, so in contradistinction to an actual infinite, a potential infinite is a collection, right? So both of these are collections. But potential infinite is a collection that, firstly, always has finitely many members, and secondly, it continually increases without limit in its number of members, right? So it's, firstly, it has finitely many members. Secondly, it always has finitely many members. And thirdly, it's continually or always increasing. And fourthly, it's always increasing without limit, right? So it's just growing and growing and growing and growing and growing and growing as time continues, as time progresses. Nevertheless, it's always finite in number. The number of members in the collection is always finite. Okay. So, for instance, if we think about a clock that just ticks, okay, as it's just ticking as time goes by, we can suppose that it ticks forever and ever and ever. The number of ticks that will have occurred as time progresses is a potentially infinite collection, because the number of ticks that will have occurred as time progresses, right, as time goes from here to here, it's always finite. The number of clicks that have happened is always finite, but it's growing. The number of clicks that always have happened grows to 3, and then the next second it grows to 4, and the next second it grows to 5. So yeah, that would be a potentially infinite collection.
I do have one question. I do recall someone having asked me this question on my Discord server, so perhaps you could add some further clarification. But they were reading the paper by Morriston and Malpass, and the way they characterize a potential infinite is, I could be mistaken, is not as a collection, but they represent it rather as a function. Is this correct? Is this going to be, how do we distinguish the potential infinite from being a collection or being represented as a function? As I understand it, the potential infinite can't be a set because sets can't grow and, and retain their identity. So if I have a
Mhm.
set of 1 and 2 and I add 3, well, that's a distinct set. So we're no longer speaking about the same set. Could you probably kind of clarify this kind of line of thought?
Yeah. So they just use the notion of functions as, I believe, just a useful heuristic. So I mean, they're totally cool with this talk of collections and so on. So that's the first note. The second note is that, and I actually talk about their heuristic extensively in my Hilbert's Hotel video. I have a whole section on why the endless future is an actual infinite, and I use their useful heuristics. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that this is kind of why I put this in terms of a collection as opposed to a set. So you are correct that sets are extensionally defined. That is, they're defined in terms of their members. So it's not as though you could have a set which like grows like and remains the same set. As I'm using a collection, it's basically an intentional conception of a set-like entity. What that means is that we're just using it, we're not defining collections extensionally in terms of like defined as the members that they do in fact have, but rather we define them using some sort of membership condition or some sort of criterion that has to be satisfied. And whatever it's satisfied by, that can change. But the collection is just whatever satisfies that. And then, whatever satisfies that can change and grow and so on, but it's still the same criterion. And so as I'm using it in the intentional sense, it's still a collection. This is just a stipulation, right? I'm just defining it this way. And in general, this is sort of, I think this is really what Craig is after as well, right? Because Craig obviously can't say that it's a set because sets really are defined extensionally. And he uses the locution of collection. And so what he really has to mean in order for this to even make sense is some sort of intentional set-like entity. That is, some sort of set-like entity, but which is not extensionally defined and is rather defined in terms of some, like something like a membership criterion or some sort, some sort of description that needs to be satisfied for the things to be included within the collection. So yeah.
Something like how sets were understood under naive set theory, just sort of as a loose term for some kind of collection, but nothing as a set that we understand it in the case of an actual infinite. Correct.
Yeah, so you broke up a little bit in my AirPods. I
Mm.
think basically what I would say is, as it's used in set theory, you could think of a set as basically something like an extensional collection, and then as I'm using collections, it's just all those collections that aren't extensional; they're just intentionally characterized.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay. So now that we have the actual infinite and potential infinite distinction down, do you want to cover the next points here, or do you think we are free to just move on to the arguments? What do you
No, I
think
mean,
would be
I
best?
should briefly say what I mean by, so when I'm talking about the future, I mean everything later than the present, or everything that will occur or obtain or exist. I'm not talking about the number of events that will have elapsed between now and the present, like between today, right? Like Monday, January 16th, and the moving now as time progresses. I'm not talking about that interval there, right? That's how many days that there will have been as the moving now progresses through time. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how many days there will be. From the perspective of today, how many days there will be, simpliciter. That includes all the days in today's future. It does not include some interval that's continually growing. It includes all the days in the future. If you think of time, in particular the endless future, as the positive x-axis, right? The origin of the x-axis, that's where the y-axis meets the x-axis. The origin is going to be represented as today, so Monday, January 16th. And then when I'm talking about the future, I mean everything in the right direction, everything in the positive direction on the x-axis. And I mean, once you understand that characterization and the distinction between will have and will, the future perfect on the first, and then the simple future tense on the second, it's kind of self-evident that an endless future is an actual infinite, right? Just think about the number line. How many numbers are there on that positive x-axis? There are infinitely many. It's an actually infinite number of members, even though, right, the distance between now and any point on that line is finite, right? That corresponds to the will have been. That's how many days there will have been as time progresses, as time elapses. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about all the days later than now. It's like all the numbers greater than the origin or greater than 0. And there are infinitely many such members. And they're modeled by the x-axis. In order for the future truly to never come to an end, right? This has to be modeled by the positive x-axis. And that kind of just makes it self-evident that it's at least to me, it makes it self-evident that the future is going to be an actual infinite, so long as there are determinate facts of the matter about the future. So yeah,
And we'll
again,
clear up what you mean by that tense distinction between will and will have. We'll
yeah,
cover that in the coming minutes. But okay, so now that we understand what you mean by future, you just mean future simpliciter. You don't mean the future up until maybe next month. No, you just mean the future to outline every other um, passing event. Okay,
yeah. And okay,
and
I should say briefly, we're talking about, it could either be future events that we're counting, it could be future days, it could be future
mhm,
seconds, whatever. As I put it in the post, I just say it's finite intervals, non-zero intervals, non-infinitesimal intervals. That's what we're talking about. They're finite, they're non-zero, they're
yeah,
non-infinitesimal. So that could be a second, that could be a day, that could be a year. That's what we're counting. And so for the future to be endless is for the future to be such that the number, or yeah, for the future to be infinite, rather, for the future to be an actually infinite, is basically for the number of future days or seconds or whatever to be aleph null, or the number of days each of which will occur is going to be aleph null, something like that.
okay, great. So I think we have just about everything that we need to understand the five arguments. We have laid out the Kalam. We have laid out the distinction that will be relevant for this discussion, distinction between an actual and potential infinite. We did also discuss the relevancy for these five arguments as they relate to one of the popular arguments in defense of the Kalam, namely the infinity argument. And we can, I think, now move on to the first argument. So I think
Hmm.
we'll start right here. Do you want to give them names or just call them argument one, just number two,
Yeah, we're just going to call them the numbers.
just the numbers? All right. So we
Yeah.
have argument number one. This is going to be with an endless counter.
Yeah. So basically, the future, if it's endless, is going to map on perfectly to what an endless counter does, let's say, each day of that endless future. So we're going to suppose that there's an endless counter who's counting a unique natural numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. This counter is counting a unique natural number per day of the endless future, and they're beginning tomorrow with the number 1. Now, since each day is paired with a unique natural number that the counter will count, and vice versa, it follows that the number of days in an endless future is the same as the number of natural numbers that the counter will count, right? Again, we're just pairing these one to one. In one day, the counter is going to count 1. In 2 days, the counter will count 2. In 3 days, the counter will count 3. In 4 days, the counter will count 4, etc. There's a one-to-one correspondence between the numbers that the counter will count and the days that will occur, right? But the number of natural numbers the counter will count is Aleph null, right? If the counter doesn't stop, then the counter eventually, at some point, let me rephrase that. Then each number is going to be such that eventually the counter will reach that number, right? Each natural number is going to be such that eventually the counter will reach that number. How many numbers are there? Infinitely many. Aleph null. And so if each number is such that the counter will get to that number, then the number of numbers that the counter will get to at some point or another along the endless future is Aleph null. Okay. I mean, that's the basic thrust of it, right? There are Aleph null many natural numbers. Each natural number will eventually be counted by the counter, and so it follows that the number of natural numbers the counter will count is Aleph null. And since the number of days in an endless future is the same as that number, it follows that the number of days in an endless future is likewise Aleph null. Okay, now note again that when we ask about how many days there will be, we're asking about the number of days later than the present day. We're not asking about how many days there will have been between today and the moving now as time progresses, or how many days will have been completed between today and the moving now as time progresses. Yes, again, as we talked about earlier, everyone grants that those are potential infinites. That wasn't the question, though, right? The question is posed in the simple future tense. How many events or days will occur? And if the future is endless, then Aleph null many days will occur. That does not imply that there will ever come a time when infinitely many days have been completed, right? It's not as though we're saying there's some point in the future where you can look back and be like, ah, yes, we completed infinitely many days since I started on Monday, January 16th, 2023. That doesn't imply that, right? Just as the fact that there are Aleph null many numbers greater than 1 doesn't imply that there is some single number infinitely greater than 1. You know, like you go to that number and then you look back and then you can somehow say that there have been like infinitely many numbers previously between you and 1. No, right? We're not saying that. But still, regardless, the number of numbers greater than 1 is Aleph null. Even though there never will come a number which is such that it has like sort of completed infinitely many numbers before it, as it were. And so similarly with the endless future, right? So yeah, just because we're saying that the number of numbers that the counter will count is Aleph null, we're not saying, we are not committing to there being some day somehow infinitely distant from the present at which the counter is like, oh yes, I finished counting all the numbers and I can look back and I have completed all of them. No, that's not what we're saying. Again, think about the x-axis. The number of little units on the x-axis going in that right direction is Aleph null, despite the fact that there's no point that's like infinitely far away, right? So there's no point where you can like look back and say that you've traversed the entire infinite collection. Even still, right, the number of units that are to the right of the x-axis is still Aleph null. And again, that's just how time is modeled if the future is endless. Those little units are like the days. So yes, there won't come a day which is infinitely distant in the future, and which is such that, you know, at that day there were in the past infinitely many days between that day and the present. That's not what we're saying. We're simply saying that the total collection of days in the future of today that are later than today is Aleph null. It has infinitely many members. Okay, so that's the first argument.
I do have one question. Perhaps you can clarify
Sure.
this. This actually comes from a viewer. I think it's relevant to this. They bring into question this distinction between the simple future and future perfect. They say, here, let me see if I can share it on the screen as well. They say, wouldn't it be true that if something will be, then it will have been? So is there an entailment relation between the simple future and the future perfect? And if there is, wouldn't an endless future still be a potential infinite?
Good question. So, strictly speaking, there isn't an entailment there. Suppose that time comes to an end in 10 days, or suppose that there's a last event. Well, then go to that last event. That last event will occur, But it's never true that that event will have occurred, right? Because this is the last event. There's nothing afterwards, right? So there can't be a time afterwards where it's true that it was the case that that event occurred, right? So that's the future perfect. It's future and then perfect because it looks back on itself. So if time comes to an end, if there's like a last day or something, then that day will be. But it's not the case that that day will have been, right? Because in order for it to be the case that that day will have been, there would have to be future days afterwards where you can like reflect back. So no, there actually isn't an entailment relation there. That's the first thing to say. But the second thing to say is that, strictly speaking, in an endless future, there is an entailment relation there, right? So I gave it the only case where the entailment relation fails is where there's an end, there's a last day or a last second or a last event. But what this means is that because the number of days that there will be is Aleph null, the number of days that there will have been is likewise Aleph null. Now, this is where we have to be very cautious, and it's very difficult. And this is where there are subtle distinctions here. Notice that when I've been talking about the potential infinite, and when I'm talking about the days that there will have been, I've been very careful to always say will have been as time progresses. So I'm indexing it to the growing of time, like where the now is on the B series, right? So like if today is Monday, January 16th, when I say the number of days that there will have been as time progresses is always potentially infinite, what I mean is that as this moving now progresses and you're tracking it along, the number of days that there will have been, so from the perspective of the today, the number of days that there will have been looking at this day and then looking backwards, that's going to be a potential infinite because that's always growing. That's an interval. Right, but if we're not talking about as time progresses and looking at that simple or looking at the future perfect, then we're just saying, well, how many days are such that there's a day after that day? Because if there's a day after that day, then of course that day will have been, right? And so if we're not indexing it to the moving now, then actually the number of days which are such that there's a day after that is going to be Aleph null for the same reason that the number of days is Aleph null, right? I just gave the reasons for thinking that the number of days is Aleph null, right? It's because you can put it in one-to-one correspondence with the numbers, all the natural numbers, which is what the counter is counting, right? And for the same reason, right? The number of days which have a successor day is going to be Aleph null. Because each day has a successor day, and there are Aleph null many days, and so there are going to be Aleph null many successor days. Okay, so that's very complicated, and it's okay if you have to think about if you have to re-listen to that twice. If you want to send me a message and you want to ask me further follow-up questions, that's totally fine. I can explain it. This is very difficult to wrap your mind around. But long story short, yes, in an endless future, the fact that a day will be does entail that it will have been. But what that means is just that the number of days that will have been is Aleph null. Because the former is Aleph null, essentially. And again, when I'm using this example of will have been, and I'm talking about potential infinites, I always index it to the moving now, and that's because the moving now gives us that interval, which is continually growing. But if you're not indexing it to the moving now, then you don't have that interval. You're just talking about how many days there will have been, and like I said, that's going to be in one-to-one correspondence with the days that there will be.
Cool. Okay, appreciate that. Thank you to, I don't know how to say their name.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that's a really good question. So I just wanted to really compliment the viewer for that question. That's very
Cool.
good.
Great. So that was just the first one, and so now we have the second argument, and you preface it by saying it may be a little bit different from the others, but here it's more so just a view against the view that the endless future is a potential infinite. So again, kind of relating back to the question that they just had asked us. So what do we make of the second argument?
Yeah, so the second argument is basically just, like you said, it's an argument against the view that an endless future is a potential infinite. So again, for a collection to be a potential infinite, as defined earlier in the blog post and as defined in the literature at large, the collection needs to grow as time progresses. Right? It's a continually increasing collection. It continually increases without limit. It's always finite. Okay, but as time progresses, right, the collection of future days, so the collection of days that are later than the day that we're talking about, that never grows. That doesn't increase as time passes, right? In fact, as time passes, right, days are, as it were, removed from the future and then placed into the present as time goes along them, and then they recede into the past, and then they further and further recede into the past, right? So it's just false that the collection of future days ever grows as time passes. But since growing as time passes is a necessary condition on being a potential infinite, it simply follows that the collection of future days is not a potential infinite. So yeah, that's the basic thrust of the argument. In short, you are removing when time progresses, future days aren't like continually being added on. Instead, days are like getting closer and closer, and then they move into the present, and then they recede into the past. So you're actually removing events from the future as time progresses. And so the future is not a collection that is ever increasing without limit. It's actually, in some sense, ever decreasing. but technically speaking, in terms of cardinality, it's not decreasing. If the future is endless, it's the same. It's Aleph null many days that there will be in the future. So you're just taking away members from a collection that is already Aleph null. So it just stays in its number, but you're still removing in some sense. So yeah.
To anticipate perhaps some questions from viewers, I was thinking I could imagine someone perhaps making an appeal to the distinction between an A and a B series, right?
Yeah.
But this appeal definitely won't work, because even on an A series, you can still list off all the future events. The future events are there, right? And so the idea isn't that the future events are just sort of accumulating. Rather, you kind of already have them passing. They pass from future to present to past. So even appeal to the distinction between an A and B series won't help here. But I'm not sure if you have anything else to say to that.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add to that. That's
Yeah.
correct. I mean,
Oh, but
again, at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about open theism, because in the background, I'm kind of assuming that, yeah, I mean, like, there are determinate facts about the future, even if the future doesn't exist, right? There's still like determinate facts about it, like the sun will rise tomorrow, or things like that. Like there will come a day in a billion days, things like that. So I am assuming that, and some open future views deny that. So we'll talk about that as a
yeah.
potential way of
Of
getting around.
course, if pairing an A theory with some kind of open future view will complicate it, but we'll get to that later, as you say. But now going on to the third one, this one's going to be a little bit longer, so hopefully they can stick by. But yeah, if you can break this one down for us, if you can.
Yeah. So basically, just imagine that it's true right now that the number of days, each of which will occur, is just 10. Okay? Suppose that's true. If that's true, then time's going to come to an end in 10 days from now, right? That's because, again, we're supposing that there will only be 10 more days in reality. So in 10 days' time, time's going to come to an end. And so if time is endless, that is, if time doesn't come to an end, well, then it's false that the number of days, each of which will occur, is just 10. But 10 was just an arbitrary finite number, right? Let the number be like 1.8 quadrillion. The same argument applies, right? If it's now true that the number of days, each of which will occur, is just 1.8 quadrillion, then time will come to an end in 1.8 quadrillion days. And so if time is endless, if time doesn't come to an end in 1.8 quadrillion days, then it's false that the number of days, each of which will occur, is 1.8 quadrillion. And so what this shows is that if the future is endless, then the number of days, each of which will occur, is not any finite number. It must instead be actually infinite, or Aleph null. For if it were a finite number, right, say the number n, well then time will come to an end n days from now, right? But time, we're supposing, is endless. It doesn't come to an end n days from now, and hence it is not a finite number. It must instead be infinite. It's not finite, it's infinite. If it's not finite and there's a determinate fact of the matter, then it's infinite. So that's the basic thrust of the reasoning. I mean, I put it formally there, but I mean, honestly, the formal rendition basically just says what we just went through. It's premise one: if the number of days, each of which will occur, is n, then time comes to an end n days from now. If time comes to an end n days from now, then time isn't endless. And so what follows from that is that if time is endless, then the number of days, each of which will occur, is not n. Right? But again, n was just an arbitrary finite number, and so we can generalize that if time is endless, then the number of days, each of which will occur, is not finite. Okay, and then so long as there is a determinate fact of the matter about how many future days there will be, and so long as we don't have an open future view on which like that number varies over time because like new determinate facts are added about the future as time progresses, well then it just follows that the number of future days is going to be Aleph null. It's going to be infinite. So yeah, that's the basic thrust of the reasoning.
I see. So maybe another way to illustrate this would be if we were to ask someone something like related to what Morriston gave in his paper about angels, right? I
Yeah.
mean, if God decreed that um, I count for 10 days consecutively, right? That just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 for every day that passes. It would be strange if it turned out false that I will count 10 days, like 10 numbers throughout those 10 days.
Hmm.
And so this argument really is just saying that, and again, you can correct me if I'm misunderstanding here, is really just saying that when you pick some finite interval, something arbitrary like 10, right? And it seemed like in most cases, like in this case of a finite interval, that if it were guaranteed that I would count those 10 days, we can honestly say, truthfully say, I will count 10 numbers 10 days in advance. Right? And if someone were to deny that, that would just seem, well, that just seems false because
Yeah.
I'm decreed to do so. It's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's something that's very interesting about the open future view, which tries to get around these arguments, is they have to maintain that it is metaphysically impossible. Again, because Craig's argument, all we need is just the possibility of an endless future to run this. If it's possible that the future is endless, and it's possible that, there's like a determinate fact of the matter about that endless future, like about how many days there are, well, then you're just going to get that an actually infinite collection is possible, and that contravenes their statement that an actually infinite is not possible. So all we need is that it's at least possible for the number of days that there will be to be Aleph null. Like, for it's at least possible for a future to be endless in this determinate fashion. And so, like, people who want to get around these arguments by appealing to like open theism or whatever, or even like Josh Rasmussen's proposal, which we'll talk about, which is like a variable domain open theism, like how many days there will be kind of changes as, or kind of gets modified as time progresses. They're going to have to maintain that it's like impossible, for instance, for God to determine right now that, let's say, like an angel sings praises on each day of the endless future. Because if God did determine that right now, then there's something about the present which makes it the case that there's a determinate fact of the matter regarding the infinitely many days in the future, right? Or let's not even talk about angels, because someone might think that impinges on their freedom. Just talk like about a particle. Like uh, they have to maintain that God. It is literally impossible for God to determine right now that, let's say, a particle will, on each day of the entire future, of the entire endless future, and God's like going to ensure this, and He's ensuring it right now with His infallible intention, that it like spontaneously emits some radiation or whatever, or that God determines it to emit some radiation. They have to say that that's impossible, and like that does not seem impossible. Like, what? Surely God can like just decree that, but maybe not. I guess not. Yeah, I think that's a very implausible view, at least by my lights.
All right. You do add a comment towards the end. So we didn't cover each premise of the formalized version of the argument, but in the formalization, you do have this premise: the number of future days is determinate, and you say towards the bottom, you say, note well, even open theists can accept premise 8. So the fact that the number of future events is determinate. Do you want to expand on that any further than what you've said just right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, the basic thought is that, like, you don't just need like open theism itself won't allow you to get out of this argument. You need to have a very particular kind of open theism, right? Because like open theism is compatible with there being determinate facts about the future, right? It's entirely compatible with that. So as long as there's a determinate fact of the matter about like how many days there will be, and that like doesn't change over time, let's say, uh, then it just follows that the number of future days is gonna be actually infinite, even if the precise content of those future days is neither determined nor determinate, right? So, like, maybe someone's gonna choose freely on that day, maybe not. Maybe there's no determinate fact of the matter, etc. But like, so long as it's now determinately the case that there will be that day, and that's true for each of infinitely many days, well, then you're still going to get these problems. So again, mere open theism does not help you get around these arguments. You have to have open theism of a particular kind that disallows you from talking about uh, like in some manner, the entire domain of that x-axis of positive x-axis of future days. And there's an interesting proposal that Josh gives for potentially avoiding that.
Yeah. There seems to be a question. It's not entirely related to this, but I feel like I could just get around to answering it. It's from Unlimited Blade Works. He asks, what is the difference between logical possibility and possibility and metaphysical possibility and possibility? If I can take a stab at it. So roughly, if something is logically, say, necessary, just in case that proposition is provable in some system of logic. So that's what it means for something to be necessary. And for something to be logically impossible is for it to be, for something to be logically possible is for it to be non-contradictory in that system of logic. And for P to be impossible is for it to be contradictory. And then with respect to metaphysical possibility, impossibility, you can think of it as whatever is actualizable, whatever can actually be a concrete state of affairs. So I like the example that Craig and Planninga give, right? I mean, it's metaphysically impossible that there be a prime minister that's also a prime number. There's nothing logically contradictory about that, but it certainly isn't the sort of thing that can be actualized. Hopefully that answers your question. Hopefully that kind of clears up the kind of scope of the modal scope of our discussion here. Okay, so with that being said, we can now, I think, move on to your fourth argument. And so this one, again, will be somewhat related to the previous ones, but we can go ahead and break this one down.
Yeah, so I mean, this just briefly, like I don't claim that all of these arguments are independent from one another. I'm honestly just trying to help people see what I take myself to see. At the beginning, I said if we model this correctly as the x-axis, we model the endless future correctly as the x-axis. Again, assuming that the future is determinate, not assuming that it exists, but just assuming that there are determinate facts about it. Then to me, it's just self-evident that an endless future is going to be an actual infinite in the sense of a collection, which can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. I mean, that just seems self-evident to me. So what I'm trying to help people do is just see that, right? And I'm just trying to give them various different ways. Maybe they're not independent of one another. Maybe they are. I really don't care. I'm just trying to help people see that, see what I do. Okay, so again, maybe these all aren't independent of one another, but I don't really care. Okay, argument number 4. So yeah, if the future is endless, then the days later than today, that is the days that will occur, can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. This is pretty similar to the first argument, but I'm just prescinding from the counter. Just map tomorrow with 1, map the next day with 2, map the next day with 3, the next day with 4, and so on for each natural number, right? There is no natural number n such that n fails to get mapped to a unique future day. And that entails that the number of days later than today is Aleph null if the future is endless. And so the argument, we can put it formally, premise 1, if the future is endless, then the days later than today, that is the days that will occur, can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. If that's so, then the number of elements in the collection is Aleph null, that is actually infinite. So if the future is endless, then the number of days later than today, that is the days that will occur, is Aleph null, that is actually infinite. Right, so that first premise is clearly true, right? I just specified a procedure that provides the relevant one-to-one mapping between the natural numbers and the days later than today. To deny that premise requires that there is some natural number n, such that n fails to get mapped to a unique future day. Right, but there's no such number as n, right? It couldn't be 20, say, because 20 is mapped to the future day 20 days from now. It can't be 200, right? Since 200 is mapped to the future day 200 days from now. It can't be 2 quadrillion, since that's mapped to the future day 2 quadrillion days from now, and so on. There simply can't be a natural number n that fails to get mapped to a unique future day. And what that means is that every natural number is paired with a unique future day. And that, of course, means that premise 1 is true. Again, premise 1 says that if the future is endless, then the days later than today, that is the days that will occur, can be put in one-to-one correspondence to the natural numbers. And premise 2, of course, is true by definition. Like any collection of members that can be put in one-to-one correspondence to the natural numbers is by definition an actually infinite collection. And so from those, it just follows logically and inescapably, to use Craig's polemical phrase, that the collection of future days is an actually infinite collection. So the endless future is an actual infinite.
You still got me here?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure you kind of broke out there a little bit. Okay, So for this one, I want to note something that you just mentioned earlier, which was you didn't quite care if many of these, um, if any, were independent of one another. Really, once again, just to emphasize for everyone, you're really just laying out some arguments which are supposed to allow people who say are proponents of the sort of Kalam style arguments. You're offering them a sort of insight into how it is that you see things, right? So
Hmm.
really, I just that's why I noted earlier, a lot of these may seem kind of related to one another, but they're just all different sorts of vantage points, if you will, that are going to help give a little bit more insight for those who are sort of pushing back against this sort of um, argumentative strategy in defense of the Kalam. And what's funny though is I'm seeing a lot of this becoming a little bit more popular, if you will. I think like Jacobus Erasmus and his kind of exchange with Andrew Look on this whole point. I mean, Jacobus Erasmus, he defends the Kalam all day, but he doesn't want anything to do with this infinity argument. So I kind of find it curious why so many people are keen on wanting to hold so fast onto this infinity argument when there's so many other potential areas of defense for, say, the second premise of the Kalam. But that's just another note. I just don't want anyone to think that just because the endless, or just because the future series of events could be an actual infinite, that therefore your Kalam is just from that consideration alone sort of left in ruins. I mean, there certainly are going to be other areas for a defense, say, of the second premise of the Kalam.
Yeah, yeah, okay, that's a good point, and I want to emphasize that, yeah, this, like, the considerations that I'm raising here do not by themselves, for instance, tackle the successive addition argument, right? I shared the Prosblogion video on my community tab, and some people were arguing, like, well, yeah, but, like, you can't, like, the future is not ever going to be traversed, in the sense of you're never going to, the whole entirety of the endless future is not going to be traversed, in the sense of you're not going to, like, get to the end of a process which is such that, like, there were infinitely many steps in that process, and then you look back at that point and then you're like, aha, I, traversed infinitely many days from that point to now. So they're basically trying to give, like, this argument from infinite traversal or successive addition, and they're trying to say how what I said doesn't apply to that. And what I want to say is, yes, that's correct. I'm not targeting the successive addition argument, or there are slightly different renditions of it, but it's like an argument from traversing and actually infinite. And yeah, like, I'm not tackling those, right? I'm just tackling this philosophical argument that says actual infinites are impossible because they have various absurd features, like equinumerosity between proper parts and their wholes, or these weird subtractive properties. That's all I'm targeting, right? So yeah, if you want to look at the successive addition argument and criticisms thereof, check out my Kalam playlist.
Yeah. So this is just really attacking the sort of, I keep repeating it, but the argumentative strategy that they have against just denying the existence of any actually infinite collection. So
Yeah,
what
and repeating it is fine because, this is an important point that I think is, like, just really often missed, especially if you don't repeat it multiple times. So, yeah, okay. So
great.
let's get into argument 5, and this one is from mathematical induction.
Amazing.
So that's a little bit of a scary term, but it's not very complicated. It's a weirdly named phrase because it's a deductively valid form of reasoning. The conclusion follows from the premises deductively in mathematical induction. Okay, so uh, we're not talking about, like, scientific induction, where, like, oh, all observed things that have such and such a mass obey this inverse gravitational rule, whatever law. We're not talking about that kind of induction, where you infer from observed regularities to unobserved regularities, things like that, and the conclusion doesn't strictly logically follow from the premises. We're talking about a conclusion that is guaranteed to be true if the premises are true. It is a logically valid form of reasoning. Okay, it has the following structure, right? So this is the structure of mathematical induction. P of n. So that's a little. If you could highlight that, the P of n on the first. It's in the first sentence where I'm saying where P of n means. So yeah, P of n means that some predicate P is true of natural number n. Okay? What is a predicate? A predicate is something that you say of a subject. So, for instance, I say of Esteban that he is male, right? So, is male is a predicate. I'm predicating that of Esteban, of a subject. You say it of a subject. It could be true of them, it could be false of them. It's purporting to characterize them in some manner. Okay, that's what a predicate is. Okay, so some predicate P is true of natural number n. That is what P of n means. And I'm just stipulating that 1, the number 1, is the smallest natural number. Some people define it as 0, others as 1. In different domains and different purposes, you use it, so it doesn't really matter. Okay. So here's the form of mathematical induction. So the first premise is your base case. That's what it's called. And you say predicate P is true of natural number 1. Okay, so that's P of 1. Premise 2 then says for any natural number n, if predicate P is true of n, then predicate P is also true of n plus 1. That's what's called your inductive hypothesis. And from those two, it follows that for every natural number n, P is true of n. Now let's think about that. Why do you think that conclusion follows? This is basically just iterated modus ponens. Modus ponens is a valid form of reasoning wherein you say P, if P then Q, therefore Q. So Socrates is a man. If Socrates is a man, then he's mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That is modus ponens. So this is just iterated modus ponens, right? You say P is true of the number 1, which is the smallest natural number. Then you say for any natural number n, including the number 1, right? If P is true of that number, then it's true of the successor of that number, right? The number that's that number plus 1, right? So if P is true of 1, which we said in the first premise, then it's true of 2. And again, just plug that back in. If it's true of 2, then since 2 is a natural number, then it's also going to be true of 2 plus 1, which is 3, right? So if P is true of n, then it's true of 3. Or excuse me, if P is true of 2, then it's true of 3. If it's true of 3, then it's true of 4. And you can just, again, it's just repeated applications of modus ponens. So then it follows that for every natural number n, P of n. Okay, so for every natural number n, predicate P is true of n. Okay. Now, mathematical induction can be used to prove that if the future is endless, then the number of days each of which will occur is Aleph null, in which case the collection of future days is an actual infinite, and here's how that proof goes. Okay, so suppose the future is endless, and suppose Gabriel is going to count one natural number per day of the endless future, beginning with 1 and adding 1 each day. So Gabriel will count 1 tomorrow, 2 the next day, 3 the next day, and so on. All right, so with this in hand, we can now run the mathematical induction. Premise 1 is our base case. It is true of natural number 1 that Gabriel will count 1. So again, think about the mathematical induction structure here. P is the predicate, is a number that Gabriel will count. Right, so we have P of 1. That's saying that the natural number 1 is a natural number that Gabriel will count. Okay, now for our inductive hypothesis. For any natural number n, if Gabriel will count n, then Gabriel will also count n plus 1. Now think about that. That's clearly true, right? If Gabriel eventually reaches natural number n, then clearly Gabriel also eventually reaches n plus 1, since Gabriel will simply count n plus 1 the day after he counts n, and we're supposing that Gabriel never stops continuing one number per day, right? And so if Gabriel eventually reaches n but fails to reach n plus 1 for any natural number n, he would eventually stop counting, right? And that contradicts our assumption that he never stops counting. And so it follows that if Gabriel will count n, then he will also count n plus 1. And of course, we've been speaking here in purely general terms. We've just been talking about n, which is totally abstract. And so our conclusion here holds for each natural number n. And from those first two premises, it just deductively follows by mathematical induction that for every natural number n, Gabriel will count n. And premise 4, we add that there are Aleph null many natural numbers. Premise 5, this is like just self-evident, right? If 1, for every natural number n, Gabriel will count n, and 2, there are Aleph null many natural numbers, then the number of numbers that Gabriel will count is Aleph null. Right? Think about this. Like, if there are 10 pens in my room, and for every such pen, I will count that pen, well, then what's the number of pens that I will count? Obviously, it's 10, right? So if every natural number is such that Gabriel will count that number, and there are infinitely many of those numbers, then there are infinitely many numbers which are such that Gabriel will count them. Again, I'm not saying that there will come a time at which it is true that Gabriel has counted the numbers. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about each natural number is such that there will come some point in the future at which Gabriel counts that number. And so the number of natural numbers that Gabriel will count is Aleph null. Then from 3 through 5, it follows that the number of natural numbers that Gabriel will count is Aleph null. And of course, if that's the case, then the collection of natural numbers that Gabriel will count is actually infinite. So the collection of natural numbers that Gabriel will count is actually infinite. And of course, there's a one-to-one correspondence between the collection of natural numbers that Gabriel will count and the collection of future days within an endless future, right? That just follows from the original setup, right? For each natural number that Gabriel will count, there's a unique future day on which Gabriel counts that number. And contrary-wise, for each future day, there's a unique natural number that Gabriel will count on that day. And of course, if there is a one-to-one correspondence between two collections, then they have the same number of elements. And so, since there's a one-to-one correspondence between the collection of natural numbers that Gabriel will count and the collection of future days within an endless future, and since the former number of elements is Aleph null, it follows that the latter number of elements has to be Aleph null, because again, there's a one-to-one correspondence between them, and so they're going to have the same number of elements. And what that means is just that the collection of future days within an endless future is actually infinite. That just strictly follows. All right, so that's the argument.
Yeah, it's funny. Just as I was rereading this and listening to you kind of give the brief explanation of this, it made me remember that I had shared this last argument with someone because it relates a lot with Wes Morriston's argument, including Gabriel and angels and decrees.
Mm-hmm.
And they seem to kind of think this was similar to the successive addition argument. So they ended up giving what Malpass calls the immediate predecessor objection. So their immediate reaction was, well, in order for me to count to some number, right, I have to first count its predecessor, but there is no predecessor to Aleph null, right? And so I can never count Aleph null numbers, right? And I'm curious to hear how could we set this straight? How can we distinguish starkly, if it wasn't already made clear enough, how this is not related to the successive addition argument?
Yeah, right. So we're not counting two. Like, again, just for, I know you're not like proponent of this, but just for the audience, like, we're not counting to a number here. We're not talking about we're counting to Aleph null. I'm not saying that Gabriel is going to reach Aleph null. I'm not saying he's going to finally get to like, oh yes, I reached Aleph null, and then he says it on some day like, Aleph null. No, we're not saying he's counting to a number. I'm asking how many numbers he will count along the entire trajectory of the endless future. So how many numbers are such that Gabriel counted the number, right? So of how many numbers is it true that Gabriel counted that number? And that's infinitely many. It's Aleph null, right? Because number 1 is such that he's going to count number 1. Number 2 is such that he's going to count number 2, 2 days from now. Number 3 is such that he's going to count number 3, 3 days from now. Number 4 is such that he's going to count number 4, 4 days from now, and so on, right? So each natural number is such that it will eventually be counted by Gabriel at some point along the endless future. And that strictly entails that the number of numbers that Gabriel will count at some point along the endless future is going to be Aleph null. I'm not saying that there is going to be some point along the endless future at which it is true that Gabriel has counted infinitely many numbers, and nor am I saying that there will come a point in the endless future where he reaches Aleph null itself, where he somehow goes beyond the finite and into the transfinite. That's not what we're saying. We're talking about the number of natural numbers that he counts throughout the endless future, throughout the entirety of the endless future. We're not talking about numbers that he counts to. And then we're just asking how many of those are there, which are such that at some point or another he's going to get to them. So that's the basic thrust. And again, the successive addition argument is about completing a whole collection. You're getting to an end, as it were, of a collection, and you complete it, and it needs to be Aleph null. Again, I'm not saying that Gabriel is going to get to the end of counting. By supposition, the count is endless, right? So he doesn't get to an end. It's not as though he gets to some point and he's like, oh yes, I finally completed counting through all the numbers. No, we're not talking about there coming a point in time at which he counts all the numbers. It's just like the x-axis, right? There never comes a point along the x-axis which is such that all the other points on the x-axis are to the left of it. No, that's not how the x-axis works, right? There never comes a point which is such that, there are like infinitely many equidistant points, like equidistant intervals to the left of it, right? Even still, there are infinitely many equidistant intervals, or equal length intervals, excuse me, to the right of the origin, right? So again, think of it like the x-axis. We're not saying that you're getting to some point which is infinitely distant from the x-axis. We're saying that the number of intervals, let's say, that are 1 unit long along the entirety of the x-axis is infinitely many. And that's just obviously true. You can talk about the interval from 0 to 1, then the interval from 1 to 2, then the interval from 3 to 4. How many of those are there along the entirety of the x-axis? It's infinitely many. And that is just, to me, that's as clear as day.
Yeah, and so this is exactly why in that first premise we're saying that it's true of, say, the number 1, that it satisfies some predicate that Gabriel will count it. And what we're really just asking is how many of these numbers on the number series, which by the way is infinite, satisfies the predicate will be counted.
Hmm.
And we're not asking how many will have been counted. We're asking how many will be counted. And if it's such that, say in this scenario, Gabriel is set to forever count every natural number, every single number will satisfy that predicate. That's
Hmm.
pretty much that's the thrust of the argument. There's no relation here with the successive addition argument. None of that. We got to make sure that we keep those distinct from one another.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we've gone through all 5 arguments, but perhaps before we uh, just conclude everything here, we did make some mention of open theist responses. We did make brief mention of perhaps some workarounds that they may have, and there were some comments between you and Josh Rasmussen on this topic. I'm not sure if you want to touch on those briefly, but is that something we can do?
Yeah. So one thing I want to note before doing that is that
Yeah.
none of my premises assumed a tenseless view of time. None of my premises assumed eternalism. None of them assumed that the future really does exist. None of them assumed that time doesn't dynamically progress, etc. None of them assume that. Go back, look at the premises. It is obvious that none of them talk about tense time. None of them do that. In fact, oftentimes I put my premises in terms of in terms of tenses, right? I talk about how many numbers will be counted, like of how many natural numbers satisfy that predicate will be counted. So like I actually put my arguments in terms that are friendly to tense views of time. None of them assume the falsity of tense views of time. None of them assume a tenseless view of time. None of them assume eternalism. Just again, go back, listen to the premises. None of them assume that. Okay. Even if time is tensed, right? Even if the future doesn't exist, again, the future is numerable, and the number of days that will be is Aleph null. Okay. Now, there will be, I think, potentially some open future views that are able to avoid that in some manner allow you to say that the future is endless, but which don't get you to there being a numerable collection of future days which numbers Aleph null. And the basic reason is because under such open theistic views, it's not all open theistic views again, because various open theistic views allow for, again, there being determinate facts about the future, and also there being determinate facts about how many future days there will be. It has to be a very particular kind of open theism. And this particular kind of open theism, at least as Josh Rasmussen conceives of it, says that, like, the present truths, the present and past truths actually, only ever determine that there will be finitely many more days. So, like, right now, let's suppose that the present facts only determine that there will be 1 billion more years. Now, strictly speaking, that doesn't automatically entail that time will come to an end in 1 billion more days, because, or 1 billion more years, because as time progresses, the future and past truths of that new time as time progresses might then go on to determine still more days. And so, like, maybe in uh 500 million years, like it like the present truths and past truths of that on that day 500 million years from now determine that there will be 1 billion more days after that, or whatever, or whatever I said, 200 billion more, forget it. I'm mixing up the numbers, but like it, as time progresses, as it were, like more and more determinate facts get added to how long the future will be as of that day. And so long as this process, as it were, continues, well, then you can say there's a sense in which the future is going to be endless. And yet, at every single point in time, it'll only ever be the case that there will be finitely many future days. And again, it's because the future isn't already settled. Not the entirety of the future isn't already settled. There's almost like in some sense, there's an infinite swath of the future that isn't settled by present truths, and as time goes on, more and more of the future, as it were, gets settled. Okay, so Josh, if you're listening, I'm trying my hardest. This view, like, I could go into the technical details about variable domain semantics and you know truth value gaps and like all these other sorts of things, but I'm trying to make this accessible to like the audience. So yeah, that's the basic thrust of the view. Now, how would I respond to that? One thing that I would say is like, listen, I mean, I'm just willing to say these arguments assume as a background that there is a determinate fact that, like, there's a determinate fact of the matter right now about how many future days there will be, and that doesn't like grow or that doesn't change as time progresses. So like basically, we don't have this open theistic variable domain view. I'm willing to assume, or I'm willing to grant that my argument assumes that that view is false. And so one can get out of my argument by adopting that view. Now, that's still very significant because almost no defenders, well, very few defenders of the Kalam and very few defenders of this philosophical argument accept open theism. Mind you, like, and we're not even talking about open theism. We're talking about a very specific brand of open theism, like this. I think I called it a variable domain open future view. So yeah, very few defenders of the Kalam are going to want to accept this. Like I think Craig, didn't Craig write a book where he basically like compares the open theist god to like Zeus, basically? So like Craig, for instance, is not going to want to take this route, and many theists will not want to take this route. But if that's the price of avoiding these sorts of arguments, then like okay, I'm fine. I'm fine to just say okay, let's just assume as a background that that view is false, and let's tease out some consequences of that assumption. That's the first thing that I want to say. The second thing that I want to say is that I do like wonder whether or not this is compatible with God's promises, like in the various religious traditions. So like, it might seem to be that God really has promised that there will be an endless future in the sense of like it's now like a determinate fact of the matter that the days are numerable and that number is Aleph Null. Like what is God's promise then if that's not the case? Like if it's now true, if it's now not like only true that there will be 100 more days, then like does God really reveal to us? Like I'm just wondering like how you make sense of the biblical revelation and these other sorts of revelations where it seems like God's revealing that the number of days as of God's revelation is not only finite. It doesn't seem like that. But maybe I'm wrong. Like I talk about this in my response to Josh in the comment thread or whatever. Like there might be different ways around this. You might be able to just like reinterpret those biblical passages as open theists are often want to do. But yeah. So like I guess one reservation for this view again is just how are they going to make sense of the biblical data? Like it seems as though God does indeed have a present, determinate, infallible intention to ensure that there will be infinitely many days. But again, maybe they can somehow cash this out in a way that it only entails that there will be finitely many days, and somehow that like God continually adds to that as time progresses. But so that's just a challenge. They have to make sense of, they got to make sense of the biblical witness in some manner. If they're biblical theists, of course.
Okay, so I went through some of what Josh was saying, and I like how you kind of clarified. There's his point kind of reminds me of something that Ted Sider says with respect to views on truth making and presentism. So he considers presentists who will argue that, like, they're called Lucretian presentists. They argue that there are these Lucretian facts about the world that serve as the truth makers for past pointing propositions, if you will. And what he argues is that these Lucretian facts, whatever they are, right, they kind of point beyond their instances. They're not the sorts of things that could actually qualify as truth makers for these, past pointing propositions or past propositions. And so I'm kind of imagining Josh saying something kind of similar, but for the future. What he's saying, I could be, again, kind of misunderstanding him, is you could take these present truths, which are supposed to serve as the explanation for why there's an endless series of events that constitutes an actually infinite collection. But what he wants to say is, well, whatever these present truths are, they're really pointing beyond their instances. There really aren't the sorts of truths that could explain why there is an actually infinite, endless series of future events. Um, and so I'm not sure what you think about that, but that's the first thing that kind of came to my mind. Now, obviously, Josh kind of expands a lot of this, talking about variable domain semantics and whatnot, and some other technical issues regarding semantics. But that was one of the first things that kind of came to mind. I'm not sure. Have you ever heard of this objection that Cider's given to like Lucretian presentists about pointing beyond um, some facts instance?
I'm going to be honest with you. I have not heard of that.
Hmm.
I have not looked into that
Yeah,
cranny of the literature, that nook, as it were.
yeah,
Um, but that's an interesting connection because I can look at that going forward. I mean, I guess, yeah. I mean, those are my two main responses at this point. I mean, I'm open to others, but my two main responses, yeah, are just firstly, I'm willing to assume as a background assumption that that view is false, and if that's true, then my argument's going to get up and running. And most theists are not going to want to take that route. And the
yeah,
prominent proponents of these arguments, philosophical arguments with the finitude of the past based on the impossibility of actual infinites, they decidedly do not take that view. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, yeah, I wonder how this view makes sense of God's promises of an endless
yeah,
afterlife. Like, under this proposal, I do think it has to be the case that God's current intentions are compatible with the future really coming to an end in a finite time, right? Because suppose that his current intentions were incompatible with the future really coming to an end in a finite time. Well, then something about the present, namely God's infallible intentions, determines that the like the future will not come to an end in a finite time. Like, it is a determinate fact that there will be infinitely many days in the future, it seems to me. So under this proposal, it seems as though God's current intentions are indeed going to have to be compatible with the future really coming to an end in a finite time. But like, many people think that the biblical witness tells against that. Like, God conveyed his intentions, and they don't seem to be compatible with the future really coming to an end in a finite time. But again, I could be mistaken in that. This is kind of like I said to Josh in the comments. This is at the edge of my thinking. For people who are curious, read the back and forth between me and Josh in the comment section.
Okay, great. Just before we conclude here, I just want to say thank you to Parker for coming in. He says he can't stay to watch. He's got to read Stupid Ethics, he says. Can't wait to come
Well,
back, watch Guys Are Studs. Great.
yeah. Much
I'll be
love to
able to
Parker.
much love to him. He's great. Don't call ethics stupid, man. It's
Well,
great.
you can call applied and normative ethics stupid. Don't call meta ethics stupid. I like
That's
meta
where it
ethics,
is.
but yeah.
That's where it is. And then lastly, we have Mr. Justin Sankar. Yes, my two favorite philosophers, Peter Parker and Ultimate Universalist. Yes, I think that's an apt description. Great. Well, I think that just about concludes our discussion on your post. I think we've kind of covered every base that we needed to cover rather. And so I just want to give a big thank you to everyone who stuck around. We'll be uploading this video probably in a day or two after this live stream. We'll probably also be posting it on Majesty Reasons. Is that something to put in that Kalam playlist?
Yeah, I actually already put it in my Kalam playlist.
There we go. Okay, so for everyone interested in knowing more about the Kalam, be sure to go to the description. I'll be linking Majesty Reasons, so Joe's enormous playlist on the Kalam. But yeah, once again, thank you for joining, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.
Awesome.
Woo! Let's play it.